When Gaddafi, like a rat, was dragged out of the sewer, the rebel soldiers shouted Allahu Akbar, while mercilessly beating the aged man with guns, their hands, and anything else they could get their hands on. The dying Gaddafi screamed out in pain, shouting, "You can't treat your father like this," before letting out a series of grotesque howls, sounding more like a pig. But the soldiers had no pity. Instead, they escalated the violence, creating more and more wounds on Gaddafi's body. After they toyed with him to death, the soldiers continued to play with his corpse, taking smiling selfies with it. When the images of the dead body were uploaded to websites across the globe, the bloody scene made people feel disgusted and nauseous. However, when the Libyan people saw the brutal treatment of Gaddafi, they did not criticize the soldiers for losing their humanity. Instead, they took to the streets to celebrate his gruesome death. In the streets of Libya's capital, Tripoli, cars honked, police fired shots in the air, and tens of thousands of citizens cheered. The truth is, not all Libyans had lost their humanity. Rather, Gaddafi, in his 40-year dictatorship, had turned himself into the enemy of not just Libya, but of the entire world. Gaddafi's rise to power from his birth to becoming Libya's ruler almost entirely followed the typical script of a Middle Eastern dictator. Born into a poor rural family in Libya, Gaddafi became a Nasserist in his teenage years. Since Nasser's time, the military of Arab nations had always been a hotbed for coups. Knowing this, Gaddafi quickly decided to drop out of school and join the army without much thought. Once in the military, he swiftly modeled himself after Nasser, forming a free officers movement within Libya's military. In August 1969, while King Idris of Libya was away, Gaddafi, who was then just a junior officer, commanded the Free Officers Corps to swiftly deploy troops into Tripoli. They quickly seized control of the television station and the royal palace and declared the establishment of the Libyan Arab Republic. King Idris was originally a monarch propped up by Britain and lacked a solid foundation for his rule. Although Gaddafi was only a junior officer, Libya at that time had a population of just over 1 million, and the thousands of armed men under Gaddafi's command were enough to influence the entire country. King Idris, seeing no other option, chose to go into exile. Thus, Gaddafi and his officer corps easily became the supreme rulers of Libya. The reason for the success of Gaddafi's seemingly childlike coup lay in a key factor. King Idris was unwilling to share the profits from Libya's oil wealth with the people. Objectively, Libya should have been an extremely wealthy, resource-rich country. Despite its vast territory, over 90% of Libya is uninhabitable desert. A narrow strip along the Mediterranean coast forms the country's primary habitable area, and before and after Gaddafi came to power, Libya had a population of only around 1 million. But this small population controlled a vast and enviable oil resource. Since the 1950s, Libya's oil production skyrocketed, rising from less than 1,000 barrels per day to over 100,000 barrels per day. From 1955 to 1969, Libya's per capita GDP rose from $200, on par with some of the world's poorest countries, to a relatively high level of $2,350. The rapid rise in oil wealth led to a significant expansion of the royal family's wealth, while the people, who did not benefit from the oil windfall, became increasingly resentful. This resentment laid the foundation for Gaddafi's swift rise to power. If there is one word to describe Gaddafi in the 1970s, it would be pig at the trough. Together with his barely educated comrades, Gaddafi's first major action after taking power was to share the oil wealth with the Libyan people. Starting in 1969, they nationalized the oil industry bit by bit, squeezing profits from the Western oil giants and sharing the benefits of rising oil prices by serving as OPEC's enforcer. Throughout the 1970s, Libya's oil production continued to rise, and by 1980, its per capita oil output was on par with Saudi Arabia. Riding the wave of oil wealth, little Libya amassed a jaw-dropping fortune. By 1980, Libya's per capita GDP reached $14,000, more than twice that of the United States at the time. Ordinary Libyans only needed to perform basic jobs to earn higher incomes than citizens of European countries like the UK, France, or Germany. In reality, everything in Libya was built on oil wealth. Gaddafi was merely riding the wave of the oil economy, but Libyans didn't see it that way. They revered Gaddafi as the conscience of Libya, and with the people's support, Gaddafi freely controlled tens of billions of dollars in assets. However, not everyone can handle sudden immense wealth well. Compared to the talented Saudi royal family, the nouveau riche Gaddafi had no idea how to spend such vast sums of money. His mismanagement of wealth ultimately led to his downfall. At his core, Gaddafi was a poorly educated Libyan villager, and after coming to power, he began to concentrate wealth around his immediate family. Gaddafi's eldest son monopolized industries like telecommunications and always traveled in luxury, accompanied by beautiful women. His second son, more interested in sports than politics, not only played for Libya's national football team, but also invested heavily in foreign football clubs with family money. Gaddafi's other children were equally adept at spending money, but despite the rampant corruption, it was not the primary cause of Gaddafi's demise. What truly destroyed him was his idealistic, reckless spending. In his youth, Gaddafi was a Nasserist, and the core of Nasserism was the idea of unity. Nasser envisioned Arab unity, but in Gaddafi's view, unity meant any form of consolidation under his own leadership. In the 1970s, Gaddafi's goal was to pursue the unification of Arab countries. To achieve this, in 1969, he signed the Geographical Glass Charter with Egypt and Sudan, aiming to establish a unified Arab Union state. However, when the new Egyptian president, Sadat, actually met Gaddafi, he discovered that the latter not only had a very limited understanding of so-called Nasserism, but also had no comprehension of the power disparity between Libya and Egypt. Gaddafi was simply a crude man waving money, wanting to be a major leader. As a result, after Sadat's death, the Egyptian government no longer seriously pursued the merger with Libya. After his failure in the Arab unification route, Gaddafi quickly shifted towards an Islamic route. In 1973, he ordered the establishment of the Islamic Call Society in Libya, whose purpose was to spread Islam across the Middle East and Africa. To expand his influence in the Islamic world, Gaddafi not only used this society for proselytizing, but also funded all organizations related to Islam. The most famous of these was Yasser Arafat's Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO. It was with Gaddafi's support that the PLO was able to confront Israel for nearly 30 years. But supporting just one PLO wasn't enough to satisfy Gaddafi. In the mid to late 1970s, to quickly boost his reputation, he began blindly supporting any opposition movements worldwide. He even funded organizations like the Irish Republican Army, IRA, and the Japanese Red Army, which were armed anti-government groups within the Western Bloc. In the end, Gaddafi's reckless distribution of wealth didn't bring him admiration from the Third World. Instead, because many of these groups were closely associated with terrorism, Gaddafi became globally known as the godfather of terrorists. However, even so, no country actively waged war against small Libya during the Cold War. The only military action taken against Libya was the US-led Operation El Dorado Canyon, which lasted just 23 minutes. The great power's tolerance only made Gaddafi even more brazen by the late 1980s. Not only did he continue funding various terrorist organizations, but he also directly dispatched Libyan agents to Western countries to assassinate Libyan exiles. He was even involved in orchestrating multiple air disasters in 1988 and 1989. However, Libya was ultimately not considered a valuable target by the great powers, and despite Gaddafi's antics, he didn't face significant sanctions. Yet with the end of the Cold War, Gaddafi's good times were coming to an end. Gaddafi's success and later his downfall were both tied to oil. After the two oil crises, international oil prices entered a relatively stable phase from the 1980s to the early 21st century. As Libya's oil production reached over 1 million barrels per day, the era of rapid growth driven by oil came to an end. From 1985, Libya's overall economic level stagnated. However, with the continued growth of the population, the per capita share of oil wealth gradually decreased. When Libyans enjoyed the high growth brought by oil, they didn't see Gaddafi's lavish spending as a waste, but rather as a way to boost national prestige. However, once the downturn hit, Gaddafi's lavish foreign spending was immediately interpreted as squandering precious national resources. Starting in the 1990s, Libya saw the emergence of a significant opposition to Gaddafi, but Gaddafi didn't take it seriously. It wasn't until the US destroyed Iraq in 2003 and executed Saddam Hussein that Gaddafi, feeling the chill on his neck, finally began reflecting on his life. For the first time, he extended an olive branch to the U.S. and even decided to compensate those affected by the terrorist attacks he had supported in the past. However, it was too late. International oil prices weren't going to rise because of Gaddafi's repentance, and the U.S. had no reason to preserve Gaddafi's regime. Libya's recent decline made the opposition within the country stronger. Meanwhile, Gaddafi searched the world but couldn't find a single ally. When the Arab Spring erupted, the Libyan people's dissatisfaction with Gaddafi exploded. In 2009, the great powers Gaddafi had once insulted either sat idly by or retaliated with airstrikes against their old friend. Gaddafi's brutal death serves as a lesson. No matter how much wealth or status you have, if they don't match your wisdom and morality, all they will ultimately bring is destruction.